So, what's a mutation?
Like something that's different in a person.
Yeah, something.
Like how it was in the thing that we just did.
Yeah.
Like some the kid had more fingers than them.
Yeah, exactly. So a mutation is something gets changed. So usually, in mitosis, right, a cell makes an exact copy of itself. But
something got mixed up.
Sometimes something goes wrong, and there's a change in the DNA, a change in the gene, and that's what we call a mutation. So mutations happen all the time. Sometimes they have an effect, sometimes they don't. And the only time a mutation can actually be passed on to the offspring are if it happens in a sex cell. Right? If a gene that's in a sperm or egg cell is different, that mutation is going to be passed on to the next generation.
So it's not like if a person has two different color eyes, that's not.
Well, so if a cell in my skin is dividing and something mutates, right? That cell is going to be different. But are my children going to get that?
No. Unless it's in your sex.
Only if it's in a sex cell. Only if it's in a sperm or egg cell. Then a mutation can be passed on. Now there's different types of mutations. We already talked about one. And that's about if the chromosomes somehow are altered or changed. For example, we talked in the karyotype activity about Down syndrome. What causes Down syndrome? What were you sorting in that activity? What were those things you dragged?
Was it an extra chromosome in the 21 spot?
Yeah, it was an extra chromosome. So sometimes the chromosomes during meiosis don't split up correctly, right? The two homologous chromosomes don't each go to one side of the cell. Sometimes an extra one goes. Sometimes one doesn't go at all. And that means a sperm or egg cell might have a different number of chromosomes in it. Down syndrome is when there happens to be one of those extra 21st chromosomes. And having an extra chromosome or missing a chromosome can have some impacts on a person. Right? It has some negative consequences in many different ways because a chromosome controls lots of different things about our bodies. And some of these chromosome changes become more common as the parents get older. As parents get older, the likelihood of one of these chromosome abnormalities happening increases. There's more than just Down syndrome. There's other chromosome differences like Klinefelter syndrome. When a person has an extra X chromosome, they have two X's and a Y. Sometimes a person can be born with just an X chromosome. It's called Turner syndrome. And plants and stuff, this is much more common. Sometimes in plants, they get a whole extra set of chromosomes and so forth. For example, seedless watermelons have a whole extra set of chromosomes, and that's what makes them seedless. Well, they're bred having a whole extra set.
No,
or just having
seedless watermelon.
Well, they bred them to be like that. So once they did that, they take those watermelons and they regrow them because people like seedless watermelon.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I don't know. I don't really remember having seedless watermelons. We always had seeds in watermelons.
They probably never had it.
So maybe seedless watermelons were bred in the last, 20 years or so, or 30 years. Because when I was a kid, all watermelon had seeds, you had to spit them out.
Yep.
Back when I was a kid.
Back in my day.
Yes.
We didn't have phones. We could go in the kitchen and dial the phone number.
Yeah, that is true, Isaiah. I did have to dial a phone.
A conversation. That's what my mom told me.
And the phone had a cord on it, a big long
And you
cord.
couldn't go anywhere.
No, you had to
Then
stay
would
there.
take people's heads off.
No, but you could buy a huge long cord
Like
so you
that.
could go in another room.
Like a phone
Yeah, like that. That's exactly it.
I know, because I had one.
Do you ever have
I
a
had one.
rotary phone?
No, I
You have to-
want one.
It would take forever
Yeah.
to get a phone call on it.
I have one in my room.
A rotary phone?
Yes.
That's funny. Does it work,
Wanna see
Cade,
it?
or is it after we're done with this notes? Does it work?
Oh, what the heck? It doesn't have a cord.
Oh, okay.
The rotary itself still works though.
Oh, that's cool. All right.
Maybe we can take that.
Anyway, why were we talking about? Oh, because we talked about watermelons and when I was a kid and I'm old. Okay. So having a whole extra or missing chromosome sometimes happens, and that's what we just talked about. But other times, a more common type of mutation is when just an individual little piece of the DNA gets changed. It's not a whole extra, a whole missing chromosome. It's just a random change in one of the DNA bases, which we'll be talking about today. Sometimes a new base can get added in. Sometimes one can get deleted. Sometimes it can get swapped out one for the other. But if the DNA changes, because our DNA controls our traits, if the DNA changes, the traits can change, right? And so sometimes certain chemicals can cause mutations to happen. Sometimes radiation, for example, could cause mutations to happen. This is why, like, being exposed to too much sun, which has ultraviolet radiation, can lead to skin cancer because it can cause mutations in a person's skin cells. A person that has no pigment in their skin at all, they have no
Albino.
color to their hair, no pigment in their skin or eyes, that's called, yes, albino. That's caused by one of the DNA bases being changed. Just change one base, and that's what can lead to that. So sometimes a single little change in the DNA can have a really strong effect. And if a mutation happens in an organism and it's harmful, it's usually not going to continue because that individual is not going to survive very well. But sometimes a mutation changes things in a positive way. It helps the organism live or survive or reproduce. And those kinds of mutations will usually increase in a population. Like these peppered moths, we remember from evolution. If a mutation happened randomly and it made the moths darker in color and they lived in a darker background, they'd survive better.
And the other ones won't because they're more visible.
Yes. And so these mutations, if they happen to be helpful, they can increase in the population.
That bunny's okay.
Any idea what's happening with this bunny?
Maybe its eyes are red.
They are.
They're
I'll explain it in a minute, but I'm just curious.
and some of them they're different colors. Some of them have spots on his back, and the other one doesn't.
This is the same rabbit in all three pictures. I'll tell you about it in a second. So the genes, the DNA of an organism determine the traits of the organism. But there's other things that also influence the traits, the characteristics of an organism. The environment, outside influences can also affect certain characteristics. For example, this rabbit that we're just talking about is called a Himalayan rabbit.
Was it in the sun too long?
Nope,
No.
but you're getting close. So,
Was it in the dark for too long?
not quite. These rabbits, so they have a gene in their DNA that can make their fur brown or white. But this gene can kind of get turned on or off by outside factors. This gene gets turned on by coldness. So what they did to this white rabbit up in the top is they strapped an ice pack to it. That's what this is.
Is that why it's black?
And that over time that turns on this gene to make their fur brown, and then look at it after. It's brown. So the environment can also influence how our genes work, right? If I go in the sun, I'm going to eventually develop a tan, right? My skin's going to become darker.
What if you go in the ice cold water?
Well, that's not really, in humans, that's not going to affect our genes much, but sunlight does. Our body's response, what happens is sunlight activates certain genes in our body to produce more pigments, and our skin can become darker. These plants are exposed to different types of light, and that changes how their DNA produces chlorophyll. So some are green, some are white, because the outside factors, the environment, is influencing how these genes are expressed. These two identical twins, you recognize them?
They're
From a movie.
are they from
Scary movie.
I don't know.
From The Shining.
Are they from isn't this the girl that plays in
This is an old movie again.
does he play in the old Addams Family?
I don't think so. They look kind of like
Kinda
that.
looks-
Yeah. So, do you guys know any identical twins?
I do.
You do?
They're in our grade.
Who?
I don't know their
Okay.
Aiden and Elliot Lentz.
Yeah.
Okay. Are they? Can you tell them apart?
No.
I mean, if you're
You can tell them apart because one wears blue and the other wears green.
okay. But do you think they're identical in every single way?
Probably not.
No.
No, there are some things that are probably different about them. So they have the exact same DNA, but they have some differences, some slight differences, because our DNA doesn't determine everything about us. There's also outside factors that influence it.
Maybe one goes outside more than the other.
Could be. Or there are just differences in development. One of the ways that scientists try to determine like which characteristics are in our DNA and which are not is they take identical twins that were separated at birth and adopted by different families, and they compare them. Now, if they were adopted by different families, they might have grown up in different conditions, right? Different areas of the country, ate different foods, different parenting styles, and so forth. And what they do is they look at these twins when they become adults and say, okay, well, how are they different from each other? Because the ways they're different from each other means, well, that must not be, if they like one loves broccoli and one hates broccoli, what does that tell us about our taste?
That's what they have different.
Is taste, if in that example, is taste determined by their DNA?
No.
No, because these two twins have the same DNA,
It's just what
but one
they
likes
like.
broccoli, one doesn't.
Maybe it's what they like eating. Maybe they
Yes.
never had it before.
So studying these identical twins can tell us about sort of which traits are genetic and which are not. Okay. Now, the traits we've been talking about, pea plants tall or short, purple flowers or white flowers, they're relatively simple. The thing about human traits usually is they're usually much more complex. There's not a whole lot of things where we can say, oh, my parents had this characteristic, I'm going to have this characteristic. Most human traits are more complicated. They're controlled by many different genes, or there's many alleles associated with them. So we don't usually do like a Punnett square for a characteristic of a person. Like, do you remember in that Amoeba Sisters video watch, they talked about tasting that PTC? And they were saying that a lot of times people use that for an example of an inherited trait, but it's actually more complicated than that. There are many human diseases that are genetic, right? That can be passed down in a family. Fetal ketonuria is one of them. Now, so for good point, Isaiah. So cancer is a little bit different because, like, my father had prostate cancer and my grandfather. Does that mean I will have prostate cancer?
No, but there's a good chance.
Yes.
You might.
Right. So it's not that, like, cancer, for example, isn't really passed on, but certain genes might make me at a higher risk of having cancer.
Like my grandparents had cancer, my aunts had cancer.
Right. So it changes our risk, but it's not definite.
Yeah.
There are, though, certain genetic diseases that are more clearly passed on. That if your parents had fetal ketonuria and both of them had it, then you're going to have it. So there are some traits that are like that. Or there are traits like Huntington's disease, where it's pretty clear if your parents have certain genes, then you're going to have that same disease. We'll learn about that. Sickle cell disease. Again, another characteristic is caused by a recessive gene that causes the blood cells to be misshapen. And you could sort of figure out your chances of having a certain disease if you know the parent. Tay-Sachs is another one. We don't have to worry about really the details of these diseases. But I had a friend in high school. She had cystic fibrosis, which is a disease that's inherited from a recessive gene. Neither of her parents had it, but she did have it.
Maybe her grandparents.
So probably it was somewhere in her family. Her parents both happened to have a recessive gene, and then she had the disease when she was born because she happened to get two of those recessive genes. All right. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, start really talking about DNA. This is a little repeat. We talked about DNA early on in the year, but we need to repeat it again here as we're talking about genetics. Okay, so DNA is our genetic code. It's how traits are passed on from parents to offspring. And what our genes really do, what our DNA really does, is it tells our body how to make different proteins. Proteins in our body make up almost all of our body tissue, provide all of our traits, determine how our body works. And so it's our DNA has the recipes about how to build these proteins. And we have in our bodies and our cells two types of nucleic acids. DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. We also have another type of nucleic acid called RNA. It's just called ribonucleic acid. Our DNA is found in our cells, in the nucleus, in the chromosomes. Those chromosomes are made of DNA, and that's what we see in this diagram. Here's our nucleus, here's a chromosome. It's made of DNA and some protein. It has in it carbon and hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And it's a really, really large molecule. DNA molecule has millions of these bases, these letters, one after the other. So what DNA is made out of is a bunch of different, what we call nucleotides. This is one nucleotide. And it has three parts to it that you should know. It has this phosphate, which we usually draw as like a little circle. It's got a sugar, which we draw like a little pentagon, like a little house. And then it's got a base. And there's 4 possible bases that can be in a DNA molecule. So we got a phosphate, we got a sugar, and we have a base. The bases have letters that we use to abbreviate them. The bases are A for adenine, T for thymine, G for guanine, and C for cytosine. Those are the 4 bases that make up DNA. And those bases can go in different orders, like letters of an alphabet. You could arrange them in different orders, and that's what determines our genes. What order, the order of those bases in my cells are different from Isaiah's, which are different from Cade's, which are different from Miss Ellis's. The A's and T's and G's and C's we each have are different from each other. The DNA molecule has this special shape. It's called the double helix. It's like kind of like a spiral staircase or a ladder that's been twisted, and the sides of the ladder are the sugars and the phosphates. The steps of the ladder in between are the bases. So that was discovered, and I told you this earlier, by two people called James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953. That's a spiral staircase. And this DNA molecule can copy itself. It can make an exact copy. We already talked about that when we talked about mitosis. In mitosis, the DNA copies itself and makes an exact copy unless there's mutation. And the way it does that is the 2 halves of the DNA molecule kind of unzip like a zipper, and then new nucleotides fill in those gaps. So here's some diagrams. So this shape here is you see the double helix of a DNA molecule. Okay. The purple here is the sugars and phosphates, the P's and the S's, these little circles and the pentagons. They make up the sides. And then in between are those bases. And what you see is the bases come in a different order. Right? G, C, A, G, A, C, C. And that order is what makes our genetic code. You could also see they always match up together in the same way. G with C, T with A. And that's sort of what it looks like. These show the actual molecules that make up each of those bases. So it's important that we know the structure of DNA, how it's built, and that we know how those bases match up with each other.